Bear saw the woman who saved his life years ago, then did something incredible. Under the pale, frost-dusted light of a Montana sunrise, Margaret Ellison stepped out onto the creaking porch of Pine Haven Wildlife Sanctuary. The winter air was sharp, crisp, and clean, biting at the tips of her ears even through her thick, knitted cap. She paused, breathing it in deeply, as if the cold itself might preserve her bones just a little longer. At 73, Margaret had learned to respect the way winter could both preserve and take away. The snow crunched under her boots as she moved with careful intention, her gloved hand gripping the railing for balance. The trees stood tall and still, ancient sentinels cloaked in white. It was a world hushed by frost, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, of memory, of breath, of life waiting just beneath the surface. Pine Haven was not large. It was never meant to be. Just a few fenced enclosures tucked into the wilderness, some old sheds and structures nestled into the trees, and a modest cabin she still called home. Margaret had lived here for nearly 4 decades, building the sanctuary with her own hands and the calloused, steady ones of Thomas Gray, her partner in every sense of the word. They had rescued everything from owls to foxes, but their hearts had always been with the bears. Misunderstood, magnificent, so often left to suffer because of human fear or carelessness. The sanctuary gave them a second chance, a stretch of forest to heal in, a place where they were watched but not caged, respected but not owned. That had always been Thomas's philosophy. We don't keep them, he used to say, we just give them enough time to remember who they are. Now it was just Margaret. Thomas had been gone for 15 years, claimed suddenly by a shattered ladder and a broken neck while repairing a storm-damaged fence. She had found him herself, sprawled in the snow, eyes closed, hands already cold. The memory still lived inside her like an ember, hot but quiet. Life afterward had grown smaller, not bitter, just quieter. The sanctuary had carried on, as had she, but the weight was hers alone now. Each act, no matter how small, kept something alive, not just in the sanctuary but in her. It was while she poured warm water into a trough near the edge of the eastern enclosure that she felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not with malice, not with threat, just a presence, silent and sure. She straightened slowly, hand pausing mid-pour, and turned her head toward the trees. That's when she saw him. At first, her brain refused to name what her eyes clearly saw. A massive bear stood just beyond the tree line, still as a statue, his thick winter coat frosted with snow, breath misting in the air like steam. He wasn't moving, just observing, his dark eyes locked directly on her. Something in those eyes, curiosity, recognition, something more, made her breath catch. Her first instinct was caution, not fear. Wild bears rarely ventured this close unless driven by hunger or desperation, yet this one stood calmly, not edging forward, not sniffing for food, just watching. Then he stepped forward, just one step. The snow shifted under his weight. Margaret didn't move. She barely breathed. Her heart pounded, not from danger, but from something she couldn't name. He walked to the edge of the clearing, close enough now that she could see the scar above his left eye, faint but distinct. And that was when it hit her. That scar, that posture, that gaze. A memory rushed back like floodwater breaking through a dam. Yuma. 15 years ago, she and Thomas had found him, a cub, no more than a few months old, curled beside the body of his mother, who had been shot and left to rot. He'd barely survived the cold, and when they brought him in, his fur was matted, his cries hoarse with hunger and grief. They named him Yuma, after the river that ran past the southern edge of the sanctuary. He had been small but fierce. Smart too, almost unnervingly so. Margaret had felt it even then, the way he watched her, the way he seemed to understand things no cub should. She and Thomas raised him with painstaking care, keeping their distance when they could, but unable to avoid forming a bond. For over a year, he grew under their care, fed by bottle, exercised through play, taught to fear humans again, so that he might have a chance at surviving the wild. And when the time came, they had let him go, heartbroken, but proud. She had never seen him again. Not once. Not a glimpse. Thomas died only months after Yuma's release, and part of her had wondered if losing both at once had simply been too much to bear. She had tried not to think about what had become of the cub, whether he had made it, whether he remembered. Now here he was, grown into something formidable, a beast of snow and muscle, yet carrying that same strange stillness in his eyes. He approached the cabin slowly. She didn't stop him. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she stood firm. He paused near the steps, looked at the porch where she often sat to drink her tea, then turned his head toward the window, as if remembering. He took one more step, then another. Finally, he stood before the window, towering. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one massive paw and placed it gently against the glass. Margaret felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the unbearable swell of memory, of awe. She stepped closer to the window from inside. Her eyes met his through the cold pane. Neither moved. Time ceased to exist. For a moment, it was not winter. Not now. It was everything that had ever been all at once. Then, as silently as he had arrived, he turned and walked away. His shape melted into the trees, leaving only paw prints behind, deep and perfect in the snow. Margaret stood for a long while, not trusting her breath, her thoughts. Eventually, she whispered the only thing she could. Yuma. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, tea untouched, fingers tracing the edge of an old photograph. Yuma as a cub, curled in Thomas's lap, both of them asleep. She hadn't looked at that picture in years. It had been too painful, but now it felt like a doorway reopened. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, but the cabin felt warmer than usual, as if something had returned that had long been missing. Not a ghost, not a pet, something far more sacred. She got up, pulled on her coat, and stepped onto the porch. The moon cast long shadows across the snow. In the clearing, nothing stirred, but in her heart, something bloomed. He was alive. He remembered. And somehow, across the divide between wild and human, past and present, grief and healing, he had found his way back. The morning after the bear's appearance, the air outside was brittle with cold, a biting sharpness that sliced through even Margaret's thick wool coat. Yet she barely felt it as she moved from the porch into the snow-covered sanctuary grounds, her breath misting before her face. Something inside her had shifted, some quiet, long-dormant ember reigniting. The sight of Yuma, if it truly was him, had unraveled a thread within her she hadn't realized was still knotted. For 15 years, she had carried a question heavy in her chest, like an unopened letter with no return address. Did he survive? Did he remember? Now it was as if that letter had been opened with a single paw pressed to glass. She moved slowly through her morning routine, but with a presence she hadn't felt in years. Every action was a whisper to herself. I saw him. He came to me. As she refilled feeding troughs, she kept glancing toward the tree line, half hoping, half dreading another appearance. But the trees stood silent and still, cloaked in frost, offering no sign of the great bear that had stood there just yesterday. She told herself not to be foolish. Bears roamed miles of territory. He could be long gone. It could have been a coincidence. Isn't it even a dream? But in her gut, in that place where old instincts lived, she knew better. Later that day, she went into the attic for the first time in years, brushing dust off plastic bins labeled with Thomas's careful handwriting. One was marked Yuma, 2009-2010. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside were files, photographs, journal entries, and a small, worn cloth toy, a faded blue bear Thomas had made for the cub to sleep with. She held it close, its softness nearly gone, but its weight familiar. Tears came, sudden and fierce. The memories flooded her. Yuma curled in her lap, snoring softly. His first hesitant steps into the woods, the day they let him go. He had looked back once, just once, and she had clung to that moment for years. Now there was a new image to hold, his massive form outside the window, the intelligence in his gaze undiminished by time. She spent the evening poring through their old journals. Thomas had written often of Yuma's uncanny awareness, his sensitivity to moods, his tendency to shadow Margaret during her work, his strange habit of sitting and watching the sunrise beside her, just the way Thomas used to. He's not like the others, Thomas had once written. There's something else in him, a listener, a watcher. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She sat by the fire with the journals spread around her like a nest. At some point, she rose and went to the closet, pulling out a box of old trail cameras. She hadn't used them in years, but they still worked. The next morning, she trudged out into the snow, setting up the cameras near the cabin, at the edges of the woods, near the paths she remembered Yuma favoring in his youth. She mounted one on the porch beam, where he had stood, aimed at the spot near the window. For days, nothing. No sign, just silence and snow and the long patience of the wilderness. Margaret fell back into her rhythm, but she moved differently now. There was a sense of expectancy in her movements, a quiet humming beneath the surface. Each morning she checked the cameras, always with hope, always with dread. On the sixth day she saw it. The footage showed a dark shape moving at dawn, emerging from the trees and walking slowly past the cabin. A massive bear, powerful but calm, stepping close to the porch, pausing briefly by the window, then disappearing into the trees again. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it frame by frame. The bear's head turned slightly, looking directly at the lens, as if aware it was being observed. She sat for hours reviewing the footage, memorizing every motion, every still. It was him. She was sure of it now. Yuma hadn't come just once. He had returned. The visits continued. Once a week, like clockwork, sometimes at night, sometimes in the faint light of morning. He never approached the food she left out, never growled or threatened or searched, just walked the perimeter, paused at familiar places, then vanished. It was as if he were checking in, watching, guarding. The idea seemed McBodd, and yet she couldn't shake it. He moved like someone retracing old paths, visiting old memories. At times, he stood beside the old bear den Thomas had helped build, now long empty. Once, he lingered by the grave marker she had placed for Thomas under a cluster of birches. Margaret started speaking aloud when she was alone, narrating her chores, voicing her thoughts. It felt foolish at first, but gradually it became second nature. "Morning, Yuma," she would murmur as she stepped outside. "I'm still here." There was something comforting about it, even if no one listened. Or maybe someone was. The sanctuary, so long a place of quiet endurance, now felt charged with meaning. The snow seemed softer, the trees more alive. Even the wind carried something kinder in its breath. One evening, as dusk settled and the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky, Margaret stood at the porch railing with a mug of tea in her hands. She thought of how Thomas used to join her here, how their fingers would brush, how they would sit in silence and let the forest speak. She missed him in that moment more than she had in years, not with the sharpness of early grief, but with the soft ache of old love. "He came back, Tom," she whispered to the wind. "Our boy came back." That night, her dreams were filled with motion. Snow falling in reverse, flowing up to the sky, a younger Thomas standing in the doorway smiling. A bear, eyes deep as rivers, walking beside her through an endless forest. When she awoke, there was frost on the window and a single paw print on the porch. Not fresh, but unmistakable. She began documenting everything. The dates and times of Yuma's appearances, notes about his behavior, sketches of the paths he took. She wasn't a scientist, not really, but she understood patterns, and what she thought wasn't random. He was coming back with purpose. He was remembering. Each appearance was a conversation without words, a silent testament to something they had once built together, something that had endured beyond the logic of the wild. One afternoon, her veterinarian friend Elena visited, bringing supplies and company. Margaret showed her the footage, the notes, the photographs. Elena watched with a skeptic's eye, but when she looked up, her face was unreadable. "It's incredible," she said. "I mean, bears don't do this, not like this." Margaret only smiled. "I know." Elena leaned back, eyes fixed on the screen. "You think it's Yuma?" Margaret nodded. "I don't just think, I know it in my bones." Elena stayed the night, and in the morning she found Margaret already awake, sitting at the window with her mug of tea, eyes scanning the trees. "You're waiting for him," Elena said softly. Margaret didn't turn. "No," she replied. "I'm just here. If he comes, he comes." And come he did, later that week. The camera caught him at the edge of the forest, snow falling thick around his shape. He paused beside the trail leading to the fox enclosure, glanced toward the cabin, then disappeared once more. Margaret watched the footage with a quiet smile. There was no need for contact, no need for touch, just presence, just memory. He was out there, and that was enough. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The snow fell in heavy, quiet sheets, blanketing the world in white, as if trying to erase all sound, all history. The wind had died down, leaving behind only the muffled hush of snowfall and the slow creak of tree limbs bending under its weight. Inside the cabin, Margaret moved slowly, methodically, her joints aching more than usual, her breath short. She had risen earlier than normal, uneasy. Something had tugged at her in sleep, a dream perhaps, or a distant sound she couldn't place. The feeling hadn't left her. It pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat, warning her, urging her to be alert. She wrapped herself in her thickest coat and stepped outside, the porch groaning beneath her boots, the air stinging her cheeks. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, more than a foot deep, swallowing paths and fencing, softening every edge. She looked toward the eastern enclosure, where a young fox named Ruby had taken refuge a month ago after being struck by a car. The fencing there was fragile, a temporary fix until warmer weather allowed for repairs. Ruby couldn't climb, but she could dig, and with this much snow pressing against the lower barrier, Margaret feared she might panic or wander. The path was barely visible. She pressed forward anyway, each step a test of will, the snow rising to her knees in some places. Her breath came hard now, wheezing slightly, but she refused to stop. She could feel the cold working its way inside her, curling around her bones like a whisper. When she reached the enclosure, she saw the gate sagging under the snow, the latch loose. Her heart seized. She dropped to her knees, fumbling with gloved hands, clearing the snow, calling gently, "Ruby, sweetheart, it's all right, I'm here." A rustle came from inside the shelter, and then the little fox poked her head out, eyes wide but unafraid. Margaret smiled with relief. "Good girl," she whispered. She moved to check the structure, tightening the latch, reinforcing it with rope and a wooden post she found nearby. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. As she stood again, the world tilted. Her vision went gray at the edges. Her knees buckled. She clutched at the post, but it gave way, and she fell into the snow. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She tried to push herself up, but her body refused. Her arms trembled, then collapsed beneath her. The cold soaked through her clothes with startling speed, reaching her skin, her chest, her spine. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and she felt a wave of dizziness unlike anything she'd known. She lay there staring up at the gray sky, the snow falling gently on her face. She tried to call out, but her voice was thin, lost in the thick silence. This was how people went, she thought dimly. Not in storms, but in quiet, not with drama, but with a soft fade. She didn't remember closing her eyes. When she opened them again, it was darker, the sky tinged with deepening blue. Snow had begun to cover her legs. She couldn't feel her feet. Panic rose, but it was slow, dulled by the cold. She turned her head slightly and saw, to her amazement, a large shadow moving through the trees. At first, she thought it a dream, a trick of the failing light. But then it came closer, stepping into view. A bear, massive, familiar. Her breath caught. Yuma. He didn't charge, didn't hesitate. He walked toward her slowly, as if he knew exactly where she was, as if he'd been searching. His fur was flecked with snow, his breath curling in thick clouds from his nostrils. He paused beside her, and for a moment she saw his eyes, deep, focused, and unmistakably aware. She tried to speak but couldn't. Only a whisper escaped. "You came." Then impossibly he lowered his head and nudged her gently with his snout. She felt the warmth of his breath, the weight of his presence. He nosed her shoulder, then moved behind her. She felt his body press alongside hers, a strange, massive warmth against the snow. He began to push, gently, carefully, nudging her inch by inch through the snow. She couldn't understand how or why or what instinct guided him, but it didn't matter. She surrendered to it. The world blurred in and out, trees overhead, snowflakes on her eyelashes, the dull roar of blood in her ears. She remembered Thomas's voice, low and steady, saying, "Trust the wild, Margaret. Sometimes it knows better than we do." She remembered Yuma as a cub, curling up beside her, his breath steady as sleep. She remembered the weight of love, of loss, of giving something wild a piece of your soul. When she woke again, she was inside the cabin, fire crackling in the hearth, warmth slowly returning to her fingers and toes. She was wrapped in blankets, her coat half open, a mug of water near her hand. She didn't know how she'd gotten there, couldn't remember the final steps. But when she sat up with effort and looked toward the door, she saw fresh snow scattered on the floor, large paw prints leading from the threshold to the hearth and back out again. She stared at them, heart pounding. Not just because they were real, but because they meant something that defied explanation. Later, Elena came, summoned by a satellite call Margaret had made once her hands could move. The vet examined her, eyes full of concern. "You're lucky," she said. "Very lucky. You could have died out there." Margaret only nodded. She didn't speak of Yuma. Not at first. But when Elena asked how she got back, she simply said, "A friend helped." She showed Elena the paw prints, showed her the footage from the porch camera, grainy but clear, a massive bear dragging something through the snow, not violently, not like prey, gently, purposefully. Elena watched in stunned silence. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "This isn't behavior we've ever seen." Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to convince anyone. The truth was already inside her. That night, as snow fell softly again, Margaret sat by the fire with her old journals, writing for the first time in months. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her words were steady. "I should be gone," she wrote. "The forest should have taken me, but something brought me back. Something remembered. Something wild and kind and impossibly loyal." She paused, staring into the flames. "I don't know what I am to him. Mother, memory, ghost, but he knows me. That is enough." She wrote about the years of silence, about the grief that dulled her vision, about the way Yuma's return had reopened a part of her that she'd sealed shut after Thomas's death. She wrote about trust, not as something earned, but as something given, sometimes once, sometimes over and over. Outside, the trees whispered in the wind. She stepped onto the porch one last time before bed, wrapping herself tightly in a blanket. The snow shimmered under the moonlight, undisturbed. But deep in the trees, something moved. She didn't see him this time, but she knew. She whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Yuma." And in her heart, she felt it again. That presence, that silent watching. Not a guardian, not a pet. Something older than language, wilder than memory. Something that had remembered kindness and returned it when it was needed most. The snow began to melt in small, glittering patches as early spring made its quiet approach. And with it came a shift in the sanctuary, a sense that something deep beneath the surface had begun to move again. The trees, though still bare, no longer looked lifeless. Their branches creaked not with the strain of ice, but with the stirrings of life. Margaret noticed it first in the way the birds returned to the feeders, in the rustle of foxes emerging earlier from their dens, in the faint budding of shrubs she thought had been killed off by the long, brutal winter. It was as though the land itself had been holding its breath and was finally learning to exhale. Margaret, too, found herself breathing deeper these days. Her recovery had been slow but steady. Elena had insisted she rest more, had come by every few days with groceries and medicine, with warm words that Margaret accepted with quiet grace. But what healed her more than any prescription was something no one else could offer. Each week, Yuma returned. The pattern was unmistakable now. Every seventh day, sometimes just before dawn, sometimes beneath a full moon, he would appear. The cameras always caught him, moving slowly through the trees, passing by the same points. The porch, the birch grove where Thomas was buried, the fox enclosure. Never eating, never disturbing, just watching, just being. Margaret began to sit on the porch during those times, bundled in blankets, her tea growing cold in her hands as she stared into the woods. She never called out, never tried to summon him. She didn't need to. There was an understanding now, something sacred and unspoken that hung in the air like breath on cold glass. She had taken to keeping a journal again, just as she and Thomas used to do in the early years of Pine Haven. The entries now were different, more reflective, filled with the thoughts she had never before dared to put into words. She wrote about grief, not the sharp kind that comes with loss, but the quiet grief of time, of change, of watching the world slip by without the person who made it make sense. She wrote about the sanctuary, how it had once been a dream, then a duty, and now, strangely, a kind of sanctuary for herself more than the animals. And she wrote about Yuma, of course, page after page, not trying to explain him, not trying to prove anything, just remembering, witnessing, honoring. One morning, while sorting through old storage in the cabin loft, Margaret discovered a box she didn't recognize at first. It was buried under tarps and worn blankets, labeled in faded marker, Legacy. She carried it down carefully, her fingers tingling as she lifted the lid. Inside were old pamphlets, handwritten mission statements, drawings Thomas had made of the sanctuary's original layout, in a thick folder labeled Proposal Youth Outreach Program. Margaret stared at it, stunned. She had forgotten this part of their dream. Years ago, she and Thomas had planned to open the sanctuary to young people, students, volunteers, even troubled teens, offering them a place to connect with nature, to learn compassion and care. But after Yuma's release and Thomas's death, the dream had been shelved, buried beneath the weight of survival and sorrow. She spent hours reading the proposal. Thomas's notes were everywhere, full of passion and idealism. Let them see the wild not as something to fear, but something to belong to, he'd written in the margins. Let them witness kindness not as weakness, but as power. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. Was it too late? Was there still time to share what they had built with others? She wasn't young anymore, wasn't strong, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that she still believed. The next week, she called the local university and spoke with a professor in the environmental sciences department. His name was Caleb, and he remembered visiting Pine Haven once as a student in the 90s. He was shocked to hear from her. "We thought the sanctuary had closed," he admitted. "After your husband passed." Margaret chuckled softly. "It never closed. I just got quiet." She told him about the bears, about the foxes, about the forest still teeming with life. She didn't mention Yuma. That was a story she wasn't ready to share. Not yet. But she did talk about the youth program, about reviving it. Caleb listened, then said something that made her smile. "I have students who would leap at the chance to help, to learn. We can start small." And so they did. By the end of April, 3 university interns arrived. Ellie, a soft-spoken biology major, Raj, an exuberant wildlife photographer, and Will, a forestry student who reminded Margaret of Thomas in a dozen small ways. They brought notebooks and cameras, questions and enthusiasm, and they treated the sanctuary with reverence. Margaret showed them the routines, the feeding schedules, the animal logs. She told them the stories, not just about the creatures, but about the land, the trees, the winters, the strange quiet of watching a hawk circle for hours. One afternoon, Raj asked her why she had stayed all these years. "Most people would have left," he said gently, "after losing someone, after the hard seasons. Why didn't you?" Margaret took a long moment before answering. "Because I never felt alone here," she said at last. "Even when I was. This place remembers." They worked alongside her for weeks, repairing old fencing, restoring pathways, documenting animal behavior. Margaret watched them closely, noting how they moved, how they spoke to the animals, how they listened to the forest. They were good kids. They cared. One evening, as the group sat around a small fire pit near the main cabin, Will turned to Margaret and asked, "Do you ever think about what comes next? I mean, after?" He trailed off, unsure how to say it gently. Margaret smiled. "After I'm gone." He nodded, sheepish. She looked into the flames. "I think about it all the time. That's why you're here. This place was never meant to die with me." That night, Margaret stepped out onto the porch once more, the stars bright overhead, the trees whispering in the wind. And then, like a ritual now written into the rhythm of her weeks, she saw him, Yuma, standing at the edge of the forest, his silhouette massive and still against the night. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched. And then she noticed something different. He wasn't alone. A second, smaller bear stood a few paces behind him, timid, curious, young. Margaret's breath caught. A cub. Not Yuma's, perhaps, but one following him nonetheless. Learning from him, trusting him. Yuma turned slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. Then he turned back to the trees and disappeared, the cub trailing behind. Margaret stood there long after they had gone, the stars swirling above her, the forest alive with promise. She felt something settle in her then, something like peace, not the absence of grief, but the presence of meaning. Yuma had returned, not just for her, but for this place, for the memory of kindness, for the continuation of something bigger than any one life. She stepped back inside and wrote a single line in her journal before bed. The wild remembers. The sun rose slowly over Pine Haven, spilling pale gold across the sanctuary, as if the light itself had decided to linger a little longer in this quiet corner of the world. Margaret stood at the edge of the birch grove, her boots nestled in soft earth newly free of snow, the early warmth of spring brushing against her lined cheeks. Around her, the forest exhaled after its long hibernation. Birds sang from the trees, their calls bright and clear. Squirrels darted across limbs. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a fox barked twice, sharp, brief, alive. She rested her hand on Thomas's memorial stone, weathered now with age but still strong, still upright. Her fingers traced the engraved letters as if reacquainting themselves with a language she had once spoken every day. She didn't cry, not anymore. Grief had softened into gratitude. Loss had become a shadow she no longer feared, but often turned to greet, like an old friend who still visited from time to time, uninvited but not unwelcome. The sanctuary was alive again, and so was she, not in the same way as before, but in a way that mattered. In a way that allowed her to look toward the future without flinching. The interns had returned for a second round of work, joined now by 2 more volunteers from a nearby conservation group. The sanctuary had grown busier in the last month than it had been in a decade. Margaret oversaw everything with quiet focus, her presence as steady as the trees. She no longer did all the heavy lifting, but she offered wisdom, perspective, and stories. Always stories. They listened closely, these young people, writing down her words, asking her questions that made her reflect in ways she hadn't in years. One afternoon, Ellie came to her with a sketch pad in hand. "We've been thinking," she said, her eyes bright. "What if we created an illustrated field guide? Something for visitors. Something that explains the sanctuary's history, tells the story of the bears, the land, your work." Margaret smiled gently, heart swelling at the thought. "Not my work," she corrected. "Our work, mine, Thomas's, and now yours." The interns began compiling notes and drawings, collecting images from old archives and newly taken photos. Margaret gave them access to her journals, her maps, even the old proposals she and Thomas had once called their legacy plan. They worked in tandem with a quiet reverence, as if they sensed the importance of what they were preserving. Not just animal records, but memory, devotion, and something harder to name. The sanctuary wasn't just a place. It was a story that had to be told slowly, with care, with humility. They were beginning to understand that. Yuma's appearances continued, though less frequent now. Once every 10 days, sometimes longer. Each time, Margaret would feel it before she saw him. A quiet shift in the wind, a pause in the rhythm of the forest. She would step onto the porch, her cane resting against the railing, and she would wait. And each time he came, tall, silent, steady. He never crossed the boundary of trees anymore. He simply stood and watched. Sometimes the young cub came with him, growing more confident, its movements no longer nervous but curious, exploratory. They were a strange pair, one weathered and wise, the other new and unshaped. Together they seemed like a living echo of everything Pine Haven had ever meant. One evening, as the sun melted into the mountains and painted the trees in amber and rose, Margaret asked Will to join her on a walk to the old bear den, the very one she and Thomas had built so many years ago. It had gone unused in recent years, overgrown and partially collapsed. With some effort, they cleared the entrance, revealing the hollow interior lined with brittle straw. "I want to rebuild it," she said, "stronger this time, and bigger. Not for cages, for rest, for shelter." Will nodded. "We can do that." They spent the next week working on the den with the others, hauling wood, reinforcing beams, layering the floor with fresh cedar bedding. By the time it was finished, it looked nothing like the old version. It was better. An open structure with no barriers, just a low roof and a wide entrance, nestled under the trees like an invitation rather than a trap. They called it the resting house. That night, Yuma returned again. Margaret saw him approach the new den, nose the fresh earth, then circle it slowly. The cub followed close behind. They didn't stay long, but before leaving, Yuma paused and looked once more toward the cabin, toward the porch where she stood. He blinked, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Margaret wrote about it that night, her hands shaking slightly, not from pain, but from awe. "He approves," she scribbled. "I think he knows what it's for." The final Sunday of May arrived warm and bright, with wildflowers blooming along the edges of the trail and bees humming in slow loops through the grass. The volunteers had prepared a small ceremony, nothing grand, just a moment of reflection and recognition. They placed a wooden sign at the sanctuary's entrance, hand-carved with care, "Pine Haven Wildlife Sanctuary, a home remembered." Below it, a quote from one of Margaret's journals: "Kindness is not forgotten in the wild. It lives on, in paw prints and memory." Margaret stood before the sign, cane in hand, breath shallow but steady. The group gathered around her, eyes shining. Raj lifted his camera and asked gently, "Would you like us to take your photo here?" She thought about it, then shook her head. "No," she said. "Take a photo of the sign. The story's already been told. It doesn't need my face anymore." Later that afternoon, while the volunteers cleaned up and the forest sang its slow songs, Margaret walked alone down the winding path that led to the western clearing. She moved carefully, each step deliberate. She had brought with her one final item: Thomas's old field journal, worn soft at the edges, its leather cover cracked but intact. She reached the clearing and sat on the flat rock where she and Thomas used to rest after long days of work. She opened the journal to the first page, ran her fingers across his handwriting, and then, slowly, she turned to the back, where blank pages waited. She took out a pen and wrote, "May 30th, 2025. The sanctuary is in good hands. The bears have returned. The land is healing. So am I." She left the journal there, tucked inside a weatherproof box beneath the rock, where future caretakers might find it someday. A map of memory, a ledger of devotion. That evening, Yuma returned for what would be the final time. Margaret saw him from her window, standing beneath the moonlight with the young cub at his side. He looked different somehow, quieter, more distant, as if the tether between them had done its work and was gently loosening. She stepped outside, heart aching in that strange way that beauty often brings. "Goodbye, old friend," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering." He turned just slightly, just enough. Then he walked into the trees, and this time he did not look back. Margaret stood for a long time, listening to the forest. When she finally went inside, she did so with no sadness, only wonder. The wild had answered her kindness with loyalty. It had sent back the one creature she had once let go in love, and in doing so reminded her that no act of care is ever truly lost. That night, as she drifted into sleep, the wind through the trees sounded almost like breathing. She dreamed not of the past, but of paw prints in soft earth, of young hands tending to injured wings, of wild eyes meeting human ones without fear. She dreamed of a world that remembered what kindness looked like. And in that world, she was not alone, not anymore. Bears block cars on the highway. When people learn the truth, everyone is shocked. The sun had only just begun to stretch its pale fingers over the horizon when the convoy of vehicles rolled into the heart of Denali Reserve. A thin veil of mist blanketed the forest floor, curling around the bases of towering spruce and birch trees like breath exhaled from the earth itself. It was early summer in Alaska, but the air still held a bite, crisp and clean, filled with the sense of damp moss and pine. Birds chirped distantly, a few more daring rays of sunlight filtering through the trees to catch on the dew-laced leaves. The lead vehicle, a rugged forest green van fitted for off-road excursions, slowed as it approached a bend. Inside, the tour guide, a man in his 50s with weathered features and a calm voice, was sharing a story about bear migration patterns, gesturing out toward a gully that sloped into a dense patch of thickets. His words trailed off as something unusual came into view. Just beyond the curve, directly on the dirt path, two massive grizzly bears stood side by side, unmoving. Their shaggy coats glistened with moisture from the mist, and their powerful forms exuded both stillness and tension. Between them, curled in a small heap, was a cub, motionless, limbs awkwardly splayed, as if it had collapsed mid-step. The guide's hand froze in midair. "Everyone stay calm. Stay inside the vehicle," he said quietly into the intercom that connected the cars behind him. The brakes hissed as each vehicle rolled to a stop, the passengers inside murmuring in confusion, craning their necks for a better look. Cameras were raised. A few gasps echoed from the second van, where the passengers had a better angle on the scene. What at first seemed like an awe-inspiring wildlife sighting quickly shifted into something far more serious. In the third vehicle, a woman in Ranger Green leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "That cub isn't moving," she murmured. She turned to the man beside her, also in reserve gear. "Is that, Anna, do you see the breathing?" The woman leaned toward the glass, watching for a sign, any sign of motion in the small body. After a few heartbeats, she gave a slow nod. Shallow. Very shallow. The three of them were part of the Denali Wildlife Medical Response Unit on a scheduled field observation ride, shadowing the tourist group to monitor animal activity and observe interactions in case of emergencies. They hadn't expected it to be called into action so soon. The guide spoke again, calmly and clearly. "Remain still. Do not open the doors. Do not make noise. We may have a serious situation here." His words, though quiet, carried a weight that stilled the chatter in the convoy. Tourists looked at one another with wide eyes, the mood shifting from excitement to concern. The adult bears had not moved. One of them, a slightly larger female, likely the mother, tilted her head as if listening. The other bear's ears twitched back and forth, its body tensed but not aggressive. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, quiet but unmistakable. Protective. A warning, not a threat. The medics exchanged glances. "They're not going anywhere," the male medic whispered. "She's guarding that cub." "They both are. But they're not advancing. They're waiting." Anna's voice was calm but laced with urgency. "If we don't act, that cub might not make it. But one wrong move." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the car knew the stakes. The decision was made quickly, silently. The team gathered their gear, non-invasive medical kits, fluids, heat packs, stretchers, no tranquilizers, no weapons. This would have to be done with trust and understanding. They stepped out slowly, first opening the doors just enough to slide through. The moment the click of the latch echoed into the clearing, both bears shifted. The female lowered her head slightly, hackles raised just a touch. The growl returned, deep, guttural, but still controlled. The male bear took a half step forward, muscles rippling under thick fur. The medics froze, keeping their bodies relaxed, non-threatening. The guide, still watching from the lead van, reached for the radio and spoke again. "They're not attacking. They're letting them approach." Every eye in the convoy was trained forward now, cameras forgotten. The forest held its breath. Slowly, step by step, the medics approached the cub. Each movement was deliberate, no sudden gestures, no direct eye contact with the adults. When the trio were within just a few feet of the cub, they dropped to a crouch. The male medic reached forward with gloved hands, gently touching the cub's side. Its fur was cold. The breathing was slow, labored. A quick assessment confirmed their fears. Signs of hypothermia, low responsiveness, possible dehydration. Time was not on their side. The team conferred in soft murmurs, barely louder than the rustling leaves. The only answer that made sense was transport. Careful, immediate evacuation to the nearest wildlife aid station, just under 5 kilometers away. The cub was gently lifted onto the stretcher, wrapped in thermal blankets, and cradled as securely as a newborn. As they stood, carrying the small body between them, the mother bear let out another sound, this time higher in pitch, almost mournful. The medics paused. One of them turned her head slightly and met the bear's gaze. Not challenging, just an acknowledgement. "We're not taking her away," she said softly, though the bear couldn't understand words. "We're trying to save her." As the convoy slowly began moving again, the adult bears did not chase. Instead, they stepped back, melting into the tree line like shadows returning to the forest. But they didn't disappear entirely. Even as the vehicles rolled on, the glint of eyes could be seen among the mist and underbrush, tracking the stretcher's path. Silence settled over the tourists. The usual chatter, laughter, and camera clicks were absent. Even the forest seemed quieter, more reverent. The tour guide, one hand still on the wheel, exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "I've been doing this for 20 years. Never seen anything like that." In the back of the van, a child sat wide-eyed, clutching their mother's hand. "Will the baby bear be okay?" they whispered. The mother didn't answer right away. She looked out the window where the trees blurred past in the low morning light and said, "I hope so. I really do." Ahead, the road curved gently toward the aid station, where a team would be waiting, unaware of the quiet procession on its way, 3 humans carrying a life between them, and 2 grisly hearts trailing behind in the mist. The road to the wildlife aid station was rough, carved into the earth by years of patrol trucks and supply vans. As the convoy bounced along the uneven path, the medics in the rear vehicle kept their focus fixed on the young grizzly cub lying still between them. Swaddled in layers of thermal blankets and warmed by hot water packs, the cub remained motionless, its chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm. The woman seated beside it, Anna, kept one hand gently resting against its side, her eyes scanning the pulse oximeter clipped lightly to the cub's ear. "Heart rate's holding, but low," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Beside her, her colleague Jason kept his gaze outside the rear window. Shadows flitted through the trees. "They're still there," he said quietly. "The adults, tracking us from the woods." Anna didn't look up. "I know, let them." Neither of them spoke of fear, but both felt it sitting heavy beneath their ribs. It wasn't fear of attack, not exactly. It was the weight of being trusted by creatures who shouldn't trust them at all. The adult bears had made a choice, a silent, instinctive decision to let these strange, soft-skinned beings take their cub. And now the medics bore that responsibility like a sacred burden. When the aid station finally came into view, a simple wooden structure built at the edge of a clearing with a low roof and large steel frame doors, Anna felt her body release some of the tension it had been carrying. Jason radioed ahead, and 2 station staff emerged from inside, already donning gloves and rolling out a mobile stretcher. The vehicles came to a halt in a loose half-circle near the entrance. The tourists were instructed to remain in their vans, windows up but eyes open. No one protested. Even from inside, they could feel the weight of what was happening. The medics stepped out first. Carefully, wordlessly, they transferred the cub from their vehicle onto the waiting stretcher. The staff took over with practiced hands, wheeling the small, motionless body into the station as Anna and Jason followed close behind. Inside, the station was warm, clean, and humming with quiet efficiency. The cub was transferred onto a heated table under dim lights. An IV was quickly inserted into a vein on its foreleg. Monitors were hooked up. The team moved like a single organism, fluid, fast, focused. No one wasted time speaking unless it mattered. Jason called out vitals. Anna prepped warming fluids. Another staffer started a glucose drip. For a long time, the only sounds in the room were beeping monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through the small nasal mask fitted around the cub's snout. Outside, the forest waited. The mist had lifted slightly, but the edge of the woods still held shadows. A station volunteer posted near the rear window gave a quiet alert. "They're here." Anna walked over and peered out. Just beyond the clearing, 2 figures stood still among the trees. The same adult bears, silent, statuesque, watching. She turned back toward the cub. "They never left." "They're waiting for news," Jason said softly. He didn't mean it as metaphor. Somehow it felt exactly true. The cub remained unconscious. Hours passed. The sun crept higher, burning off the mist and casting golden light through the windows. But inside, time didn't seem to move. The staff rotated out in shifts, but Anna and Jason stayed. They cleaned the cub's paws, checked its gums, gently brushed twigs and dried sap from its fur. Everything was done with reverence, with care. They weren't just treating a patient. They were trying to earn back a trust that had been offered on borrowed time. At one point, the cub gave a twitch, just a subtle flick of one paw. Anna's breath caught. She leaned closer. Another twitch, a shudder in the shoulder. Then a small, dry sound, almost like a whimper. Jason checked the monitors. Heart rate rising, breath slightly empty stronger. The IV fluids were taking effect. The warmth had reached the core. Slowly, the cub stirred. It took nearly an hour, but finally its eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, but alive. The room stilled. Anna leaned down, her face close, but not too close. "Hey, little one," she whispered. "You're okay. You're safe." The cub blinked slowly. Its body trembled as it tried to shift, instinct pressing it to stand. It didn't get far, just a slight lift of the head before exhaustion settled it back down. But the spark was there, the will to move. Jason smiled, just a flicker at the corners of his mouth, but genuine. She's a fighter. Outside, the bears waited. When Anna glanced again through the back window, the adults were still standing just at the tree line. No sound, no movement, just two enormous guardians holding their vigil. It's like they knew we wouldn't hurt her, Jason said. Like they recognized something in us. Anna didn't reply. There were no easy words for what had happened, or was still happening. She walked outside for a moment, stepping quietly onto the gravel behind the station. The breeze was light now, brushing against her cheeks. The trees ahead stood tall and unmoving. And there they were, the two grizzlies, just far enough to be safe, just close enough to be sure. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, hers and the mother bear's. In that instant, Anna felt something unspoken pass between them. Not gratitude, not understanding, but a kind of recognition, ancient and instinctive. As if the bear was saying, I have watched you, I have seen your hands, I will wait. Anna stepped back inside. She's stable, she said. Not strong enough to go yet, but close. Jason nodded. They kept the room dim, quiet, peaceful. Over the next hour, the cub rested, occasionally shifting its paws or blinking slowly. It drank from a bottle once, weakly. Hope grew. The tourists were eventually escorted away, their vehicles departing slowly, leaving only the medical staff, the station volunteers, and the unseen but ever-present guardians at the edge of the forest. Word had already begun to spread across radio and local ranger channels, but no press was invited, no drones flew overhead. This wasn't a story for headlines. This was something sacred. That night, no one slept deeply. Staff took turns watching the cub, monitoring its breathing, keeping the room warm and silent. Outside, the bears remained. When morning came, they were still there. And the cub, though tired and stiff, lifted her head, looked toward the open window, and made a quiet, mewling sound. A call, a signal. Anna looked at Jason. He nodded. It's time. They didn't carry her out. They opened the rear door, let her walk, let her choose. And as she stepped onto the grass, still trembling, still fragile but alive, she walked, on her own, toward the misty tree line, where two shadows waited. The sun was higher now, suspended in a cloudless blue sky, its rays cutting through the thinning morning mist like golden spears. The warmth that settled over the Denali Reserve was a soft, embracing kind, not harsh, but healing. At the wildlife station, however, time moved with a different rhythm. Inside the treatment room, though the cub had been led outside and was now resting in a shaded patch of grass not far from the open gate, the air still pulsed with caution and reverence. Every movement was measured. Every word, if spoken at all, was spoken in a whisper. Anna stood near the threshold, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Her eyes locked on the tiny figure lying beneath a spruce tree, not 20 yards from the building. The cub was curled up tightly, its breathing more even now, its ears twitching occasionally in response to distant birdsong or the rustle of leaves. And beyond it, further into the woods, yet unmistakably present, stood the two adult bears. They hadn't moved, not truly. They had shifted slightly through the hours, repositioning as the sun crept across the sky, but they never broke formation, never wandered, always facing the clearing, always watching. It was as though an invisible thread stretched from the cub's small, recovering body to the massive form standing beneath the tree line, one that pulsed with quiet energy and unspoken longing. Jason joined her at the door, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee that he hadn't sipped. 6 hours now, he said softly, voice rough. Still there. Anna nodded but said nothing. What was there to say? The facts were plain and yet defied explanation. In any typical encounter, grizzly bears, especially mothers, would have charged or fled or at the very least kept their distance after an incident like this. But these two had defied every known behavioral pattern. They had let humans take their cub. They had followed. They had waited. They continued to wait. You think they're really just watching? Jason asked. Or is there something else going on? Anna shook her head. I don't know. Maybe it's instinct. Maybe it's intelligence. Doesn't feel like either. It feels like something in between, something older. He glanced toward the cub, then at the bears, then back at her. You think they're going to come closer? I think they're waiting for the right moment. Anna stepped outside, walking slowly into the light. The sun bathed her face in warmth, but she didn't smile. Her eyes remained fixed on the forest. She walked toward the cub, slow, cautious, respectful. The little one looked up, blinking lazily. It didn't flinch. Anna crouched beside it, checking its paws, the IV puncture on its leg, the state of hydration. Everything looked stable, better. There was strength now, where earlier there had only been stillness. You're almost ready, aren't you? She murmured, brushing a bit of pine needle from its fur. Just a little longer. Behind her, Jason remained by the doorway, watching both her and the woods. The other staff inside remained quiet. Everyone understood now. This was no longer a simple case. This was a threshold between two worlds, human and wild, held open by the fragile, flickering thread of trust. As the day wore on, the cub napped in the sunlight, then roused to drink from a shallow bowl of water. It made soft grunts, curious little sounds, and sniffed the air as though trying to locate something long familiar. Several times, it looked toward the trees, and each time, the adult bears remained still, unmoving guardians standing among the shadowed trunks. At one point, a light breeze stirred the grass, and the cub rose clumsily to its feet, wobbling slightly. Anna and Jason held their breath. The cub took a few unsteady steps, then sat down again. But it was a beginning. The forest remained quiet, too quiet. Birds had ceased their calls near the station. Squirrels and smaller mammals kept low and out of sight. The presence of the two great bears had created a hush across the underbrush, as if the entire forest knew something sacred was unfolding and dared not interrupt. Evening began to creep in. Shadows stretched longer across the clearing. The sun began its descent, dipping toward the edge of the horizon and tinting the sky with faint strokes of amber and rose. In the station's common room, the staff discussed quietly whether to move the cub inside for the night or let it remain outside under observation. Anna stood firm. Let her stay. If they've waited this long, we owe them the chance to see it through. No one disagreed. Blankets were brought out and laid gently near the cub. A small heat lamp was set up at a distance. Jason remained outside while the others rotated in for food and rest. Night approached slowly, then all at once. The warmth faded from the air, replaced by the dry, brittle chill of high-latitude twilight. The sky turned cobalt. Stars began to blink awake, and still the bears remained, just visible in the moonlight, still standing, still waiting. Anna returned to the cub around 10 o'clock. She sat down beside it, wrapping herself in a thick jacket, her breath fogging in the air. They're still out there, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the bears or the stars or some unseen force holding the balance of this moment together. The cub, now visibly stronger, shifted and stretched, yawning wide, then looked out at the darkened forest. Its small ears perked up. Then came a sound, a low, soft chuff from the trees. Barely audible, but unmistakable. A call, not urgent, not commanding, just a sound of presence, recognition. The cub rose, not all at once, but with purpose. It turned toward the tree line, took one step, then another. Anna didn't stop it, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. The cub walked slowly, steadily across the field, through the grass, toward the trees, toward the bears. The two massive figures did not move until the cub was halfway across the clearing. Then, in perfect synchronicity, they stepped forward. Not quickly, not aggressively, just forward. 20 yards, 15, 10. The cub made a small, almost happy grunt and broke into a wobbling trot. When it reached them, the larger bear, the mother surely lowered her head and gently nuzzled the cub's side. The second bear did the same, brushing its face against the cub's neck. For a long moment, the three bears simply stood there, pressed close together. A family reknitted, no dramatics, no roars, no wide cinematic gestures, just silent reunion. Jason had stepped out and now stood beside Anna, both of them watching with open awe. You think they'll just leave now? He asked quietly. Anna didn't answer. The bears turned, first the adults, then the cub, and began to walk. Back into the trees, back into the darkness. No hesitation, no fear, just a return. The brush swallowed them slowly, gently, and then they were gone. The clearing emptied. The night deepened. And in the silence that followed, Anna felt a strange weight lift. Not the absence of responsibility, but the fullness of something completed. A circle closed, a debt honored. Jason let out a long breath. That's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. Anna smiled, but her eyes were still wet. Yeah, she said, me too. Morning came softly, seeping through the canopy like melted gold, filtering through every needle and leaf until the forest floor was dappled in light. The wildlife aid station stood quiet, its weathered walls still carrying the memory of the night before. Inside, the staff moved with the kind of hush that comes after witnessing something rare, something holy. The bears were gone, and yet their presence lingered, like the echo of a song still resonating in the air long after the final note had been played. Jason poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to Anna without a word. She took it, nodded her thanks, and leaned against the railing of the back deck, her eyes scanning the tree line, though she knew they wouldn't return. Not today. Maybe not ever. But she looked anyway. The dew was still thick on the grass, and a few crows had begun to reclaim the clearing, hopping and pecking as if nothing extraordinary had happened there just hours before. A fox padded silently along the edge of the woods, paused as if sensing something strange in the earth, then slipped away. Feels different, Jason said, his voice quiet, like we're standing in a church after the sermon's done. Anna gave a soft hum of agreement, sipping her coffee. I don't know what that was, she said finally, but it wasn't just biology, it wasn't just instinct. Jason didn't reply. There wasn't anything to add. They'd both seen the way the adult bears had moved, deliberately, with awareness, with restraint, the patience, the trust, the restraint not to intervene when their cub had been carried away. The silent presence outside the station for nearly a full day. The reunion that had unfolded without a sound, without fear, without anger. And perhaps most powerful of all, the way they had disappeared, not in haste, but with grace, as though they knew the story had reached its end and it was time to close the book. Later that morning, a park administrator arrived by helicopter. He was briefed quickly and spent an hour reviewing footage from one of the few low-res cameras mounted near the station. The video captured only fragments, blurry silhouettes through mist and trees, shapes that moved with heavy grace, shadows that became forms, then family. When he was done, he simply removed his glasses, rubbed his face, and said, "This stays between us. No media call, no press release, no drone footage leaked." The staff agreed without discussion. There was no hunger for recognition, no thirst for credit. What had happened didn't belong to science alone, or conservation, or even the reserve. It belonged to something older. The word that floated in Anna's mind was covenant, a pact between worlds that usually never touched, but for one stretch of time had overlapped through necessity and care. The day passed with a kind of stillness that mirrored the forest beyond. No new patients arrived. The tourists had all returned to the visitor center, still murmuring about what they'd witnessed, unsure how to process it. A few of them had cried in the vans, though they weren't sure why. A few others had deleted their photos, realizing somehow that the memory was more sacred if it remained unshared. That evening, Anna walked alone to the spot where the cub had first stepped back into the woods. The grass was bent where it had passed. A single claw mark scored the bark of a nearby tree, faint and harmless, as if left as a signature. She crouched there for a moment, resting her hand against the mark, and listened, not for footsteps or growls or movement, but for silence, for the kind of silence that comes only when something profound has ended. Then she rose and began the slow walk back. The next morning, she and Jason hiked a short loop through the area where the bears had waited. They found tracks, deep, clear prints pressed into the mud like fossilized memory. They didn't follow them far. They didn't need to. It wasn't about the direction. It was about the weight of presence. In the following days, the reserve staff worked quietly, returning to their duties but changed, subtly each one. Conversations were softer, arguments less frequent. A kind of reverence settled over the team, unspoken but ever present. They had seen what it meant to be trusted by something wild. They had been offered a window into a moment of extraordinary grace. One afternoon, Jason found Anna sketching something in her notebook. Three bears, standing close together, the cub nestled between them, their forms silhouetted against the soft mist. No detail, no dramatics, just outlines, just closeness. He watched her draw for a moment, then asked, "Think she'll be okay out there?" Anna nodded without hesitation. "She's got them. That's more than most." The weeks passed. Other animals came and went. Elk with injuries, foxes with mange, a raven with a broken wing. But none brought with them the weight of that one morning in the mist. Sometimes the team found themselves glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see the mother bear again, or the cub, stronger now, grown, returned out of curiosity or some thread of memory. But they never came. They didn't need to. What had happened wasn't meant to be repeated. It had been enough. One evening near the end of summer, a small group of rangers and medics gathered outside the station with cups of coffee and blankets. They talked about the usual things: equipment repairs, trail closures, the arrival of autumn. And then gently the conversation drifted to that morning, not in detail, not to dissect it, just to remember. One ranger said, "It's funny, we're trained to keep our distance, trained to never intervene unless absolutely necessary." But that day, it was like the rules didn't matter. Anna shook her head. No, the rules still mattered, but something more important did too. Jason added, "It wasn't just that we helped, it's that they let us." There was a pause then, a long, silent one, filled only by the crackle of a nearby lantern and the distant call of a loon across the lake. Eventually the group dispersed, the conversation dissolving into the quiet of dusk. Anna lingered a while longer, staring out toward the trees. The stars were starting to appear, blinking softly one by one. And for a brief moment, just a flicker, she thought she saw movement far at the edge of the woods, a shifting shadow, a silhouette. But it passed, and she didn't chase it. She only smiled, stood, and whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." Behind her, the aid station glowed faintly with light, a quiet sanctuary built not just for treatment, but for moments like this, moments when the world and the human touched, not in conflict, but in compassion. Somewhere deep in Denali, three bears walked beneath the canopy, together, alive, whole. And across the clearing they had once stood watch in, a single truth remained suspended in the air like mist, that patience, humility, and care could bridge even the wildest of distances. Autumn crept into Denali with quiet authority, its breath cool and constant, turning the tips of the birches gold and copper. The scent of the forest shifted, no longer the wet, earthy perfume of summer, but something crisper, tinged with frost and fallen leaves. Winds swept gently across the ridges, carrying with them the faint, almost musical rustle of drying branches. At the wildlife aid station, life moved on, as it always did. The memory of the bears, of that cub, of that reunion, had settled into the place like a whispered story passed from one breath to the next, not often spoken aloud, but always present. It lingered in the air, in the way staff paused at the back door each morning to glance at the tree line, in the way tourists lowered their voices when they asked about grizzlies, in the way Anna sometimes found herself staring at the empty space in the clearing with a strange ache she couldn't quite name. She didn't expect to see them again. None of them did, but the mind plays tricks in quiet places, and hearts remember differently than heads. Some nights she dreamed of the cub, not sick, not weak, but running through the underbrush with the lightness of youth, her fur healthy, her eyes bright. Sometimes the dreams included the mother bear, silent and watchful, always just on the edge of her vision, as if making sure she was still watching too. One morning in mid-October, just as the frost had begun to linger past sunrise, Anna stepped out into the clearing and found tracks. Not fresh, but not yet erased. One large, one slightly smaller, and one small, almost dainty, though pressed deep, as if the bear it belonged to had run hard through this very space. She didn't call for anyone, didn't take photos. She only crouched and placed her hand beside the print. Then she closed her eyes. She thought of the long, misty morning months ago, the moment the cubs stirred on the warming table, the silhouette of two great bodies in the trees, the soundless reunion, the way they had vanished without fanfare or ceremony. Her breath caught in her chest, not with fear, not with sadness, but with the strange fullness that sometimes comes when grief and joy are twined so tightly they're impossible to separate. Behind her, Jason approached, sipping from a tin mug, his boots crunching the frostbitten grass. You saw them too, huh? Anna didn't look up. I don't know if it's them. Could be any grizzly. Jason knelt beside her, examined the tracks, and gave a low, knowing hum. Could be, he said, but you and I both know it's not. Anna stood slowly, brushing the frost from her gloves. Why now? She asked, not expecting an answer. Why come back? Jason didn't answer directly. He looked toward the woods. Maybe it's just what we said that day. They let us help, and maybe now they're just letting us know. It worked. The two of them stood there for a while, watching the forest as if the trees might speak. Eventually, Anna turned and walked back toward the station, her steps slow and even. She didn't tell the others. She didn't log the sighting. The prints would vanish by tomorrow, softened by wind and covered by the falling leaves. That night, while most of the team had retired to their cabins, Anna sat alone by the back window, sketching again. Her pencil moved gently over the page, tracing the outline of a bear. Not the cub this time, not the family, just a single bear walking through falling snow. Around it, the trees bowed low, their branches heavy with frost. She didn't draw eyes, didn't draw the forest floor. Only shadow and shape. She didn't need detail, she already knew who it was. When Jason found her there hours later, he said nothing. Just placed a fresh mug of tea beside her and sat down in the chair across from her. They didn't speak, they just listened. To the wind, to the groan of the log settling, to the silence that surrounded the station like a blanket. And deep in that silence there was something else. A memory? A murmur? No, not quite. It was an echo. That's what Anna realized, not of sound, but of presence. A lingering warmth where something extraordinary had been. Not gone, just moved on. The following morning, Anna took a walk alone along the edge of the river that curved behind the station. The water was clear, ice cold, lapping softly against the stones. She stood by it for a long time, watching the current, thinking of the path the bears might have taken. Maybe they were far from here now, already settling into a den for winter. Maybe the cub had grown strong enough to fish on her own. Maybe they had found new valleys, new spaces untouched by roads and voices. She hoped so. But some part of her also hoped that, when the snow melted and the air softened again in spring, they might return. Not for help, not for treatment, but just to pass through. Just to remind her that the line between wild and human isn't as sharp as people think. That there's a middle space, a bridge. She returned to the station just before lunch, her cheeks pink from the cold. The sky above was clean and pale, the way it gets in the deep north before snow. Inside, the common room buzzed with quiet conversation. A delivery of supplies had come in, and one of the newer medics was reading a field report aloud. But Anna barely heard. Her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the clearing, toward the line of trees. Nothing moved, and yet the echo remained. A few days later, a postcard arrived from a couple who had been in the original convoy, the tourists who'd witnessed the cub's rescue. It was addressed to Anna and Jason, though the names had been guessed. The note was simple. We think about that morning often. It changed how we see the world. Thank you for letting us witness it. No name, no return address, just a photograph of Denali's ridgeline on the front and a sketch of 3 bears etched faintly along the bottom margin. Anna smiled when she saw it, then tucked it into the station's logbook. Not as a case file, not as a record, but as a keepsake, a reminder. The season wound down, snow began to fall in earnest. Tracks became rare and the forest quieted. Winter came heavy and full, and still, from time to time, someone would glance into the woods and pause a little longer than necessary, not expecting to see the bears, but remembering, feeling, listening for the echo. And on one still night, months later, long after the snow had buried the grass and the station lights had dimmed for the evening, a shape moved silently through the trees beyond the clearing. Large, fluid, confident. It paused for a moment near the bend in the trail, lifted its nose to the air, and stood still, just watching. Then slowly it turned and disappeared into the forest. No sound, no sign, only the echo remained.